Something extremely important happened at the end of the Australian Grand Prix, and surprisingly, most fans didn't even notice it. Because while the headlines were focused on dramatic overtakes, strategy chaos, and late race tension, a completely different conversation was already happening quietly behind the scenes, where several drivers, including Max Verstappen, were discussing the possibility of rejecting certain agreements connected to Formula One's new regulations. And this wasn't just a casual complaint, because the issue comes from the brand new hybrid system introduced for the Formula One 2026 regulations era, where on paper, the numbers look incredible, since these power units can now deliver around 750 kilowatts of total power, making them some of the most technologically advanced engines the sport has ever seen. But hidden inside that number is a critical detail. Almost half of that power now comes from electrical deployment, which means battery energy has become just as important as the combustion engine itself. And in theory, it sounds like the perfect blend of performance and sustainability. But in reality, the situation on track is far more complicated. During the Australian Grand Prix weekend, something unusual started appearing in telemetry data, where cars traveling at full throttle were suddenly losing up to 50 kilometers per hour halfway down the straight. Even though the drivers weren't lifting, the problem wasn't braking, and it wasn't aerodynamics either. The batteries were simply running out of energy. When that happens, the electrical boost disappears instantly, leaving the combustion engine to do all the work. And the result is a sudden drop in acceleration, exactly the kind of thing that shouldn't be happening in the fastest racing series in the world. For drivers, this creates an entirely new challenge, because instead of pushing flat out every lap, they now have to constantly monitor how much energy they're using and where they're using it, which means Formula One drivers are starting to feel less like racers and more like energy managers. And once you understand that problem, the growing tension inside the paddock suddenly makes a lot more sense. Because if this system continues to create unpredictable speed differences on track, the consequences could reach far beyond strategy, and it could even change the very identity of Formula One racing. But the real reason drivers began questioning these rules only became clear once the telemetry from qualifying was analyzed. To understand why the debate exploded after the Australian Grand Prix, you need to look at the physics behind the new engine philosophy. Because the 2026 power unit regulations were specifically designed to dramatically increase the role of electrical energy, whereas in previous hybrid eras, the combustion engine still provided the majority of performance and the battery system mainly acted as an extra boost. Now that balance has changed completely. Nearly half of a car's total power depends on electrical deployment, which means the way energy is harvested and used has suddenly become one of the most important strategic elements in the entire race. And this is where the first major problem appears, because not every circuit allows the batteries to recharge efficiently. Tracks with heavy braking zones, like Canadian Grand Prix or Singapore Grand Prix, naturally generate large amounts of energy recovery, since every time a driver brakes hard, the system converts kinetic energy back into electrical power. But circuits like Albert Park Circuit are very different. If you're a real Formula One fan, make sure you subscribe so you never miss the stories happening behind the scenes of the sport we all love. Because the truth about Formula One is often even more intense than what we see on race day. Now back to the topic. Because the layout of Albert Park features long, sweeping corners and extended full throttle sections, which means there are far fewer opportunities to regenerate battery charge during a lap. As a result, drivers must constantly choose between attacking and conserving energy, since pushing too hard early risks running out of deployment later on the straight. This dynamic created one of the most fascinating battles of the race, where during an early fight for position, Charles Leclerc and George Russell exchanged positions repeatedly with 7 lead changes in just 9 laps. But what looked like pure racing aggression was actually something much more strategic. Leclerc compared the boost system to a Mario Kart power-up, and surprisingly, that comparison is technically accurate. When drivers activate maximum deployment, they unleash the full 750 kilowatt output of the hybrid system. Acceleration becomes incredibly strong, but the battery drains quickly. And once that energy is gone, the driver immediately becomes vulnerable. And if you study the onboard footage carefully, you can actually see the strategy playing out. Because when Charles Leclerc launched an attack, George Russell sometimes waited half a lap before responding. And that short pause allowed his system to recharge just enough to deploy power again at the perfect moment. Suddenly, racing wasn't just about braking later or carrying more speed through corners. It was about predicting energy cycles. For some drivers, that complexity makes the sport more interesting. But for others, it feels like Formula One is slowly drifting away from pure racing. And no driver expressed that frustration more clearly than Max Verstappen. Because during the race itself, Verstappen experienced a problem that exposed just how fragile this new system might actually be. While some drivers were adapting to the new hybrid system, Verstappen's race started with a serious setback. Because during the formation lap, his car experienced an unexpected battery drain. And by the time the race began, telemetry showed he had very little electrical deployment available. That meant when the lights went out, Verstappen launched with almost no hybrid boost. In modern Formula One, that's a huge disadvantage, because even with fresh tires, his acceleration off the line was weaker than the cars around him. And instead of attacking for positions, he immediately had to focus on recovering places. But what happened next showed why Verstappen is still considered one of the most complete drivers on the grid. Because despite the energy issues, he fought through the field and eventually finished 6th, proving that even in a system heavily influenced by energy management, driver skill can still make a difference. However, not every team struggled with the new regulations. For example, Mercedes-AMG Petronas Formula One team appeared to have a much more stable energy deployment strategy, allowing their drivers to maintain consistent battery levels and deliver reliable acceleration throughout the race. And that difference quickly turned the conversation inside the paddock political. Some drivers began questioning whether the new rules were actually improving racing, and Lando Norris even admitted that the cars feel more complicated and less natural to drive compared to the previous generation. But others disagreed. George Russell suggested that opinions might simply depend on performance, joking that drivers who win under the new rules probably won't complain about them. And that has always been true in Formula One. Every major regulation change creates winners and losers. But beyond performance and politics, another concern started to appear during the race. And this one was much bigger. Because the way these power differences appear on track might actually be creating a risk that Formula One cannot ignore. The biggest concern with Formula One's new power system might not be strategy or competition. It might be safety. At the start of the Australian Grand Prix, one car suddenly slowed because it had almost no electrical deployment left. And even though the driver ahead was still pushing flat out, the car simply couldn't accelerate the same way without battery boost. The result was a sudden speed difference between cars on the straight. In some cases, that gap reached 40 to 50 kilometers per hour. In a sport where cars are already traveling well above 300 kilometers per hour, that kind of unpredictable slowdown can be extremely dangerous, because drivers approaching from behind may not expect the car ahead to lose acceleration so suddenly. And that's where the real concern begins. Several drivers admitted after the race that managing battery energy throughout the lap feels unpredictable, because one car might exit a corner with full electrical boost, while another might have none left at all. That creates what engineers call an accordion effect, where the field constantly compresses and stretches because different cars accelerate at completely different rates. For race control and team engineers, that is far from an ideal situation. If these speed differences continue to appear during races, may eventually need to step in and review the regulations. Because while the new hybrid system was designed to push technology forward, the sport still needs to maintain one simple principle. The fastest racing series in the world should never feel unpredictable for the drivers. And if this system continues to create sudden power losses on the straights, Formula One might soon face a very difficult question. Are these regulations improving the racing, or slowly changing the DNA of the sport itself? If you found this story interesting, you should definitely watch my previous video. F1 teams are working through the night and different starts at Melbourne. FIA changing rules again. In that video, I break down why teams were literally working overnight in Melbourne and how the FIA's sudden rule adjustments could affect the entire grid. Trust me, once you see what was happening inside the garages, the entire race weekend makes a lot more sense.